Good afternoon. Very welcome to all our arrivals of participants, of listeners, to the fourth session of our public webinar, Afghanistan from Buddhism to Islam, 8th to the 13th century. And it gives me really great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Majid Montazer Mahdi, who is a member of the Invisible East team, which is hosting this event. But before I do so, for those who might not have been with us for previous sessions, just to summarize that this is a 5-week webinar that we've been running. This is the fourth. We've had one a week where we have looked at issues of Islamization. We've looked at rural administration. We've looked at the Bamyan Buddhas. We've looked at and then today we're going to look at more closely at the question of Islamization, or the interaction of people of different religions in Afghanistan in this period, which I think might interest people a lot, given the many questions we've had in the previous sessions, which often referred back to this question of how did people interact with one another, people of different faiths. So let me just introduce you to Dr. Montazer Mahdi. He's a historian of Islamic law and is currently, like I said, a postdoctoral research associate on the Invisible East program here at Oxford University. In the Invisible East program, he works on Persian documents from medieval Afghanistan. Majid was trained as an Islamic legal scholar at Tehran University. He received his master's degree in Muslim cultures from Aga Khan University, the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, in 2012. He submitted his PhD in Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter very recently, and he is a new PhD. His dissertation deals with the biographical dictionaries of Shi'i ulama written in the 17th and 18th centuries. Majid has also contributed to the ERC Kitab project at the Aga Khan University in London, editing Arabic and Persian manuscripts. His article on the reading culture of Shiraz in the Mongol era appeared in a volume called Cities of Medieval Iran, which came out with Brill in 2020. He also contributed to the Institute of Ismaili Studies Muslim Biomedical Ethics project as a research assistant. And his latest contribution was the translation of the Arabic excerpts into English in the Fazail Bauch, which was a collaboration between Majid, myself, and other colleagues in Oxford and Iran, which was published through the prestigious Gibb Memorial Trust series last year. And Majid has also written reviews that have appeared in Reading Religion online. So without further ado, Majid is going to talk to us about Islamization, a closer look. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Arzu, for a very extensive introduction. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I hope that it pays off the time that you spent here. What I'm going to talk today is about Islamization, a closer look. I try to, at first place, to put in a very broader sense what is Islamization would mean, and different scholars, how they conceptualize Islamization. And then I move to a more closer look to these different definitions of Islamization and how the scholars, when they use these concepts, what were their findings. And then I come back to our project and the focus of our project, which is Islamic Aid East. And I try to give you a survey of what has been done, and then what are the ways forward that we are trying to achieve through the works that we are doing in Invisible East project. So one of the key issues, I think, with the question of Islamization is that many people, when you are talking about Islam and Islamization, they think that Islamization is synonym to the conquest, the military conquest of the lands. And as soon as they were conquered by the Arab Muslims in 7th and 8th century, the Islamization was the process, was an organic, immediate process. However, the historical studies shows that there is a serious delay in all forms of Islamization, whatever your concept of Islamization it is. So when we are talking about Islamization, we are not talking about the military conquest of the lands. It's very easy to talk about the military conquest of the lands because it's more clear. However, when you go into details of even the conquest, you see that the process was more complicated than the way that the historical narrative sources told us about. That it was not epical, it was not immediate, and it was a long process of different negotiations, different military actions and battles, and it's the process of conquest was also complicated. But at the end of the day, it's more clear. It's clearer than the Islamization in any sense, because at the end of the day, the conquest has very physical indications, and whatever your definition of the conquest would be, there's always a physical element that identify the last point, or at least some solid point for identifying a conquest. But for Islamization, it's more elastic and flexible when you want to identify the process of Islamization, let alone a very specific point in the history that say that, okay, from this point on, we have this full Islamization, conversion, and so on and so forth. So bear in mind that when we are talking about Islamization, we are talking about more broadly speaking, we are talking about the process and dynamics rather than events. So when we talk about in the secondary literature, when we talk about Islamization, we might mean different things. One of the very, predominantly meanings and sense that we generally refer to as Islamization is conversion. And conversion could also mean different things, but it's a matter of religion. What is very solid in this sense is that conversion is a matter of religion, changing of the rituals, changing of faith, and so on and so forth. But even when we talk about conversion, we're talking about at least two different layers of conversion. One layer is the individual conversion, which is basically most of the time is a romantic understanding of conversion in the pre-modern history. As a kind of change of faith through orientation of soul. And you can see the anecdotes of these kinds in the salvation history, which were written by the Muslim scholars. And you find in hagiographical works, in history of Islam, Syria, and so on and so forth, as a way of articulating the miraculous element and nature of Islam. But most important and more important form of conversion is a communal conversion, because when we are talking about pre-modern societies, we are talking about communal oriented populations. So many things, including religion, has a communal aspect, which is inevitable in analysis of the historical matters. So if I want to follow the Nock conceptualization of conversion, we have two, individual and communal, and he called it adhesion, which is a process of crossing religious frontiers, but it's not an event. It's more a very continuous process, that the acceptance of new worships as a useful supplement and not substitute. This is very important, that when we are talking about the Islamization, we should think of the we should think out of the box of orthodoxy, because today, when we want to talk about conversion, there's an element of orthodoxy, that's it's the core of the process of conversion. While in pre-modern society, it's very hard to pinpoint certain points of orthodoxy, let alone that for the new converts, new Muslims, for example, they leave all their history and heritage back and then move to new faith. So when I'm talking about the communal and even individual conversion, please bear in mind that I'm not talking about the Salafi sort of or Puritan sort of conversion, but we are talking about a continuous process of on the different levels. So going back to Islamization, one is conversion. The other one, which is very broad in its scope, is the institutional Islamization, which means that adopting and assimilating to adopting the Islamic rule and institutions. And in this sense, by an institution, I'm not thinking of physical institution like mosques, but more about the law and the polity, the Islamic polity, the law, the tax, and so on and so forth. These are very, very defining elements that after the conquest, they became very prominent when we talk about Islamization. So it's the broader sense, in the broader sense, when we are talking about institutional Islamization, it means that after the conquest, how fast or how late the Islamic institutions, regardless if they are religious or not, because bear in mind that when we are talking about Islamic, it's a convenient name rather than a religious name. So it doesn't mean that whatever I'm calling Islamic, it means that it has a root in Quran or Hadith. What I'm trying to convey is that there's a certain forms of institutions like law, politics, even urban planning, that they grew out of the Muslim empires, the Muslim empire. So they are part of the package that the Muslim empire, the Islamic empire, brought to people of the conquered lands. So the question is that how fast these lands, these new people, accepted and adopted to this new system. And the broadest sense of Islamization is the footprint, the cultural footprint of the Islamic culture in a broader sense, as includes everything which has the label of Islamic. And the last definition of Islamization is the adopting and assimilating pre-Islamic practices into Islamic framework, which is out of the scope of this lecture. I'm not talking specifically about the things that they have a history of the pre-Islamic history, and then they turn and appropriate it by the new Muslims, regardless being Arab or not, and then turn and label as Islamic. So leave this last one out of the lecture. I will focus on these three aspects of Islamization, and more importantly, and I focus on the first two, conversion and the institutional Islamization, because cultural imprint is a very flexible idea of social change, and it's very hard to gauge such changes. While with conversion it's easier, with the institutional Islamization it's much more we are on a solid ground, so we can identify certain points in history, at least starting the process or at least completion of the process. But with cultural imprints, although it is very important, it's very hard to pinpoint certain points or even the process. So about the conversion, as I mentioned, the individual conversion is mainly anecdotal, essential track of salvation history. While communal is, we have several cases, very interesting cases of the communal conversion. One of them is the case of the Fayyum that I will discuss a little bit later, that we have this tribal conversion, the tribes that were Christians converted to Islam. And also we have early conversion of Arabs in Arabia to Islam, which were tribal in its essence. And of course, the most important part that we can identify is the conversion of elite, that because mostly when we are relying on the narrative sources versus documentary sources, we are talking about the elite. So most of the sources that we have about the early Islamic history and early conquest is basically there are narrative sources. We have documentary sources, which means material culture and documents, legal documents or administration documents, which were recently been the focus of many several studies and very interesting findings. But the main framework that we rely on them is coming from the narrative sources. So these narrative sources, they focus, they are concerned with the elite. So we can identify elite conversion, but it's very hard to investigate the popular conversion or grassroots conversion, or for example rural conversion, unless we come across very interesting case like the Fayyum that I will later illustrate more. And the last was the conversion for economic gains, that I will come back to that later. So what is important is basically what I'm trying to say, that is based on the dynamic of the society, pre-modern societies. When we are talking about conversion, we're talking about communal conversion rather than individual conversion, and it's not a theological matter. While the mindset, the Protestant mindset of the scholars in the 20th century, in early 20th century, that they investigated the question of the expansion of Islam and the conversion of the people to Islam, they mostly wanted to frame in a very Christian missionary sort of ideas. But what I'm trying to convey is that we are talking about a very specific sort of social change rather than a theological conversion. So, as you may have heard, that one of the key things in popular culture about Islam is that Islam is the religion that was spread through by the sword. So people who believe that it was the case, so they believe that the conquest basically was the main instigator of the conversion. So Islam was spread by sword. This is the very classical European style polemic against Islam. But in 20th century, there was a change of heart by the scholars. For example, Sir Thomas Arnold, in his Preaching of Islam, called Islam a missionary religion. So he moved from the paradigm of sword conversion toward a missionary religion, which after the conquest, Muslims spread around the world, and they spread the cause, the Islamic cause, and they converted people. But historically, when we look into the historical documents and historical sources, we see that was not the case. Even basically Islam, essentially, especially during the Umayyad period, was not a universal religion. It was a very specific religion for Arabs. So during the Umayyad rule in 7th until mid-8th century, the conversion was generally discouraged. And even if we have conversion, the process was very complicated. While people would say that, okay, converting to Islam is very simple. Said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa Muhammadan Rasulullah, that's it. You are a Muslim. But that was not historically the case, because if you wanted to be a Muslim, at first you need to be an Arab. And if you were not an Arab, you needed a protection from Arab tribe or Arab person to become a Muslim. So it was not easy to become a Muslim. So bear in mind that when we are talking about Islam, early conversion in Islam, it was discouraged. It was not encouraged by the Arab rulers. So they were very happy with the populations, their subjects, to be other religions. And it was, the toleration of other religions was well adapted in Islamic law from the early period. So they didn't have any problems with the subjects following other religions. But there is a change. There was a social change in the Abbasid dynasty, that we have these new Muslims, new converts, mostly Persians. They infiltrated the Abbasid administration. They became part of the administration and played an important role in forming the Abbasid Empire. Like the Barmakids, the family of the Barmakids, then when they consequently became the Wazir and the rulers of the Abbasids, they're under Harun al-Rashid. So there is a change with the Abbasid revolution that I come back with the conversion in Khorasan. But this is the I was talking about the conversion. Now, institutional Islamization was very different, because as soon as you have this conquered lands, you try to to insert your power and authority. But even in that sense, that there is a goal of inserting your authority and your administration, there's always was the risk of losing the revenue from these new conquered lands. So for a period of time, it was inevitable that for a period of time, even the Muslims, the Arabs who conquered these lands, they didn't touch anything in the administration, especially the local administration. We have a lot of documents from Egypt that showed that the administration during the early conquest, especially during the Umayyad period and before the Marwanids, they were mostly untouched by the Arabs because they didn't want to interfere in the local level of the administration, while in the higher administration, royal administration, they tried a new system. And the documents showed that it was much faster than what we got from the narrative sources, because the papyrus that we have from the Egypt shows that the language the Arabs used in the administration in Egypt was quite fully fledged in year 70 after Hijrah. So the consequence of founding an empire was that the Islamization, in a sense of institutional Islamization, was in work as soon as very soon after the conquest. But one important factor is the difference between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. During the Umayyad period, we have very simple system of governance, which is that the governor, the emir, has the total political and judiciary and religious authority. So you appoint a ruler. This ruler is qadi, is a judge, is an emir, military commander. He's a civil ruler, and of course he's also the religious authority. Because prior to the rise of Abbasi, 9th century, mid 8th century, early 9th century, there's a coincidence that we don't have the ulama, we don't have judges, and the fiqh the Islamic law was not fully fledged. So everything was very simple, in a sense that the polity was revolved around one person in the whole region, which was the commander, the ruler, and so on and so forth. But from the Abbasid period, from 9th period, we have this emergence of ulama and professional judges. So from that moment on, you have a fully fledged system of Islamic law, Islamic judiciary, and Islamic political system. So this is the way that the institutional Islamization developed in the conquered lands. So up to this point, I tried to tell you that, okay, there were different layers of changes, and these different layers of changes has different sources. So if we want to investigate these things, we need to go to different sources and to pinpoint different events. One of the key issues about the conversion, as either communal or individual, is the problem of sources. We don't have census from those periods, so we don't know anything about the population. So we need, as historians, we need to gauge new methods to use the limited sources, the limited documents and sources that we have. One of the most brilliant studies that has been done is by Richard Bulliett. Richard Bulliet did an onomastic study, a study of the names. He studied the change of the names of the people in biographical dictionaries. So one of the key features that you see in Islamic civilization, which is very, very exceptional, is that we have these genre of writings, which is about the biography of certain guilds or certain professions. And mostly, most of them were written about the ulama, the religious scholars. So we have this bulk of biographical dictionaries dedicated to ulama and recorded their names based on the locality, based on the time period, and so on and so forth. So Richard Bulliet utilized this massive literature of biographical dictionaries and tried to identify the names of the change of the names in the genealogy of these people, these scholars, to see that from which generation the names became Muslim. So he pinpointed those generations as the date for the conversion to Islam, assuming that when you change your name is the way that you change your religion, or better to say that changing a name is a sign of changing a religion. So if we identify a certain pattern in the generations, we can say that this is the pattern that happens in certain time, and this shows that the mass conversion was happened around this time. So according to Bulliet's classic study, he believed that complete conversion in Iran is dated around 900, and the other Middle Eastern lands around 1000. The main idea is that how these names changed to Muslim names. So, and he provides percentage based on this limited data that he got from these biographical dictionaries. Of course, these biographical dictionaries are massive, and they have many names recorded very studiously. But the problem is that these biographical dictionaries, they only talk about the ulama. So one of the key issues that undermine his dating is that the way that he treats the mass conversion is based on the data that he gets from the very elite part of the society rather than the general population. That's one thing. The other thing is that this data is only showing the part of the population that they converted to Islam and they became scholars. It means that if your family is a Christian or Zoroastrian and you never produce any scholar and you never converted, your name wouldn't end up in one of these dictionaries. So basically, although it is very interesting, although it is the most methodologically accurate and surgical in a sense, in the study of the conversion, its data is quite limited. But it's interesting in a sense that the dating she showed coincided with other factors that I'm going to show you. One of the key issues is that I mentioned the same dating for Islamization, for institutional Islamization. So one specific idea would be that even if we are talking about the conversion, we're talking about elite conversion, and this elite conversion coincided with the rise of a special social status called ulama. So when we are talking about this conversion, basically we're talking about the conversion of elite rather than ordinary people. So this dating does show conversion, but it shows only for a limited layer of the society rather than the general population. One case which is very interesting, which is not from Eastern lands, but it's very interesting in a sense that I want to show you that when you hit the jackpot, how you hit the jackpot, is that we have this very interesting case of Fayyum, a region in Egypt that by total chance, a ledger, a tax report survived in a form of a book called Villages of Fayyum by someone called Abu Uthman al-Nablusi. This Nablusi was sent by the Ayyubids to this Fayyum to renew the tax information that they have from Fayyum. But it, for them, was that these tax information was needed to renew. So they sent this Abu Uthman. UC Rappaport, our colleague in Queen's Mary of London University, studied in depth this Nablusi's work and showed that I'm trying to show how this very specific sort of information helps us to understand the process of conversion, how it could be. The interesting part in the case of Fayyum is the steep conversion of Christian people in the villages between 11th century to 12th century. This Nablusi realized that in a century or so, there was a very steep decrease in Christian population and conversion to Islam. And the main form of the conversion was tribal conversion rather than being personal conversion, or you have these people converting on the basis of the faith. Rather, it was based on the tribal conversion. And also, UC Rappaport, based on Nablusi's work, identified that the main impetus behind this conversion was financial gain, because there was a serious financial gain to become a Muslim versus being a Christian cult. And even the balance of the balance of the Christian versus Muslims, other than conversion, was caused by the migration of many Copts from villages, rural areas, to urban areas because of the high tax of jizya, of the poll tax levied on non-Muslims. So they moved out of the rural area to gain more income to pay the poll tax. This is very interesting because we have also documents from Egypt from much earlier time in 8th century, which shows that the jizya, the poll tax levied on non-Muslim, was not much higher than the tax that the Muslims paid as zakat, which was levied on specifically on the Muslims. So, for example, in early Islamic Egypt, financial gain was not a cost of conversion. But when we come much later to Fayyum, we see that because of the change of the policy, we have this conversion because of the high taxes on non-Muslims. But the other thing that we get from the Fayyum, the case of Fayyum, is very interesting, because in the Fayyum, regardless of being 13th century or 12th century, there was a serious segregation between Muslims and non-Muslims. So they have this map, and Yossi map it out very clearly, that there was communities of Christians, Coptic Christians and Muslims, and they were segregated. They have different areas to live, and they mostly live around the temples and the mosques. And this was the population map of the Fayyum. But in the eastern land, you see very different thing. You see the segregation. In the early conquest, after the early conquest, there was no doubt that the Arab settlers, they didn't mingle with the population, with the indigenous population. But as Patricia Crone showed, that one of the key excuse me, one of the key models of conversion between 7th and 8th century, very early after the conquest, was the intermarriage of settlement of Arab soldiers and the local inhabitants. This is very important, because you see these different patterns in different lands. So one of the pitfalls of this this limited data that we have is that we cannot exactly say that the same pattern that happened in Egypt, it happened in Eastern lands. So we need to be very careful about generalization of patterns of conversion in different lands. Interestingly enough, for example, we have this case of in our documents, because in Invisible is we work on the documents. So we try to fill these puzzle of the social change using the documents. And one of the documents that we have, and we work on them, is the documents that popularly called Afghan Geniza. They were a bulk of documents acquired by National Library of Israel, and they came from Afghanistan. One block of these documents belonged to a certain Abu Nasr Daniel, a Jewish merchant from Bamiyan, and these documents came from the archive of this Abu Nasr Daniel. So we know a lot about this Abu Nasr Daniel. And one of the interesting things that these documents show, the mingling of the Muslim and Jews in Bamiyan in 11th century. So the process, the demographic balance between Muslim and non-Muslim had changed in 10th, probably late 10th century, 11th century. So that segregation that I was talking is quite early in 7th and 8th century, but until as late as 11th century, the segregation was totally eroded. One example, one thing that one of the studies that rely and focus on institutional Islamization is Mikhail Majid's work on Egypt. And interestingly enough, also he thought that the dating of 9th century was the date that an integrated society based on Islamic governance, Islamic law, and Arabic language, which were used by all, irrespective of religious affiliation, was the dating, his dating correspond with the dating provided with the political history, which was about the rise of ulama, and this special sort of religious scholars, and also the date that provided offered by Richard Bulliett based on the biographical dictionaries. So his work does not show the conversion per se, but his work shows and confirms the findings of other scholars that 9th century was a turning point in Islamic polity, that it inserts its own way of ruling, governance, in a broader sense to these conquered lands. And they treated all the population, regardless of their religion, to a great extent with one single system. Most of these things that I have said so far were from Egypt and mostly from the Western lands of Islamicate words. But what do we know about Islamization, Islamicate East? So what we call in Invisible East, Islamicate East, basically is true province of Abbasid administration, Khorasan and Sistan, which covers nowadays, present days, Afghanistan, mostly Afghanistan, Eastern Iran, Western Pakistan, and Southern Turkmenistan. So we have this very big area that we, during the Abbasid administration, was called Khorasan and Sistan. The area mostly was conquered by Umayyads around the early 8th century. But in less than a century, one of the key forces to topple down the Umayyads came from this Khorasan. So this is very different. This is very exceptional in the role of the new Muslim, or at least the population from these lands, because especially the western part of these lands, that they involved in the Abbasid revolt against the Umayyads started from Khorasan. So it's no surprise that at the time of the foundation of the Abbasid Empire, they became a new elite of Abbasid administration. So conversion in Khorasan was quite early because of their involvement, their political involvement, at least in the elite layer of the society, because of their involvement in the revolt, Abbasid revolution against the Umayyads. So this would explain the early date of the conversion, the mass conversion that Richard Bulliett referred to in comparison to other Middle Eastern lands. I want to wrap up my lecture with one very interesting key to show that how the way we need to go beyond the narrative sources, and we need to rely on documentary sources. But the problem with the documentary sources is that they are scattered, they are piecemeal, and they're very hard to work with them. So it is very inhibiting work to do study based on the documents. But I want to show how rewarding it could be and how interesting the findings could be. Our colleague, Arzu Azad, my boss, wrote an article based on two documents. One Bactrian documents, one Arabic documents. The Bactrian documents dated 750, and it shows three brothers shared a woman, Zaran, in a household. The documents show that the practice of polyandry survived under this very late time after the conquest. But interestingly, we have a document in 5 years. After 5 years, we have an Arabic document which reports that one of these brothers, one of the 3 brothers, converted to Islam, changed his name from Kamertfar to Sa'id, and he married to manumitted slave called Zaran. So we have this very interesting story that we have 3 brothers sharing a wife, a woman, and in 5 years something happened, and the whole practice was abandoned. And now we have these new Muslims, new names, new institutions, the marriage, the Islamic marriage, and everything changed very fast. So the question is that what happened in 5 years that changed this practice, the marriage practice, so fast? Azad suggests that the change of tax system from house-based tax to tax on individuals was the impetus behind this change, this fast change of the legal practice. Bear in mind, polyandry had a long tradition in Bactria. So it was not something very exceptional. It was not something taboo, was a taboo at that time. But for an Islamic administration, it was not acceptable. But that's not the case that changed the attitude. What changed the behavior was the change of, in the high level, that they changed the taxes from households, from a house, to individuals. So people adopted new way of life because of financial gains. So this is a very interesting case to show how the conversion would happen in the very local level because of the policies that were imposed from the top. And these policies, they were not designed to convert people or to promote certain practices, but the change, the conversion, was the byproduct and contingent byproduct of these agendas, which were not about the religious change, but it was more about the fiscal changes. So you see that the conversion was not basically a theological matter, it's more a social, cultural matter, that sometimes it was instigated by very supposedly unrelated issues, but they push people toward the new practices without any intention by the upper scale of the royal administration. So what I want to say that what we know about the Eastern, the conversion in the Islamic ages is very limited in comparison to Egypt, for example. Why? Because we had limited access to documents, and the documents that we have from Islamic age lands are not investigated and have not been investigated properly and in comparative level. So I believe that the work that we are doing in Visible East could be a major contribution to understanding the Islamization in both sense, conversion and institutional Islamization, based on these documents, that we compare these documents coming from a region, that we have this a range of documents from different periods, and we can compare them in a style, in the legal regime that supported these documents, legal documents or administrative documents. So then we can have a better picture based on documentary sources rather than narrative sources, which were written on certain agendas and for certain agendas were written. So we need to move from narrative sources to documentary sources. But working with documentary sources is very time-consuming and less fruitful in comparison to narrative sources. But when it comes to fruition, it shows us better, solid findings rather in comparison to the narrative sources. Thank you for taking time to attend to this session. I hope that it pays off your time.
Well, thank you very much, Majid, for this fascinating lecture. It was wonderful to see and hear your thoughts about conversion across the Islamic world, and in particular in the East. Well, thank you so much, and I hope the audience enjoyed it. From the questions, it is clear they enjoyed it. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. And until next week, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.